Okay, so we're going to get ready to get started with our TMN Tuesday presentation today. We're excited to have Clare Escamilla here with us today, and I'm going to introduce her and her presentation here in just a moment. But before we get started again, one last tech check for everybody. Make sure that you can hear our voice, see our screen. Our Texas Master Naturalist TMN Tuesday presentation today is going to focus on watershed protection planning. And we have Facebook Live going. For those on Facebook, we're not going to be monitoring chat or questions during the live event, but we will check into those after the event is done. For those of us on WebEx, we're going to be using chat today and focusing on talking about the audio and video settings for those joining us on WebEx. All right, Claire, I'm showing 12 o'clock. Are we ready to get started?
Yep, I'm ready.
All right. Okay, so again, just welcome everybody to our TMN Tuesday event for July 2021. We have Clare Escamilla with us. She's going to talk about Texas watershed protection planning. As always, with any of our Texas Master Naturalist events, we always like to go through a quick tech check for everybody who's joining us today. So that we can make sure that everybody is ready to learn and to join us in the presentation and get the best experience out of it. So if you are new to our WebEx events, our TMN Tuesday events, fear not. As an attendee, you cannot unmute and you cannot share your video, and this is on purpose because we have tons of attendees joining us today from all over the state, and I think I saw somebody from outside of the state earlier. So it's exciting to have everybody joining us, and we're going to be using a different function to allow for interaction with our speaker today. So while we won't have you able to unmute or share your video, we are going to have an interaction through our chat function. Again, if you are joining us for the first time and you have not checked your audio and you're still having some audio issues, I'm going to leave this screen up here so that you can read through this real quick. You want to make sure that you use that audio settings tab on your computer. You want to make sure that you've got your audio, your speaker output volume turned all the way up, and make sure that you've got the right speaker connected. You also want to make sure that you have your speakers plugged in. That was an issue we encountered a few weeks ago. So just get everything all turned up. All right, and then as mentioned, we're going to be using the chat function to interact with Claire today. For those of our attendees that are joining us by WebEx, we're going to be using the chat function. If you're joining us on Facebook, once again, we won't be monitoring that during the live presentation, but I will circle back around to those questions and try and ask those questions to Claire at a later time. So for our live presentation right now, we're going to be using WebEx chat. Claire has built in some open discussion times throughout, but we're going to try and make sure that she stays on time and we get you through this 1 hour lunch presentation today. And so some of those questions we may hold until the very end, and we're going to try to get to everybody's question. So again, if you will use that chat function. Please use clear and full sentences for your questions and avoid acronyms so that I can make sure that I ask Claire in the best manner to get you the best answer for your questions. And as always, please keep all chat on topic and professional. And then finally, closing that up, if you have additional issues with WebEx, please use the phone number on your screen for the call center. And there's also the WebEx Help Center website. Of course, I'm getting interrupted today, and I apologize about any of my background noise. That's how it goes in this household some days. Okay, so jumping into the topic of today's presentation. Thank you guys so much for joining us. We have Clare Escamilla with the Texas Water Resources Institute. She's going to talk about Texas watershed protection planning. As always, save the date for our future TMN Tuesday events and our Be the Change August 10th and August 17th coming up. Some great content, and I'm not going to take too much more of Claire's time today. Oh, I forgot about this one. Last one, I promise, to get us started here, Claire. I'm trying to rush so that I get you the most time possible today. Just final reminders of our webinar etiquette. We have attendees that are not able to unmute, but that's on purpose. We have our chat room open on our WebEx. For those that are joining us via WebEx to ask questions in our chat, make sure you've selected to everyone. Please be respectful and professional in all questions and comments, and please use full and clear sentences so that we can get your question answered. This session will run for 1 hour. If you are a Texas Master Naturalist, this can count for 1 hour of advanced training. Log that under with your VMS admin in your local chapter. And then finally, the recording of today's event will be posted on our website. Right below the link that you used to register for today's event, we'll get that recording posted either later today or first thing tomorrow morning. Okay, now that's it, I promise. We have lengthy intros, but we just want to set ground rules and make sure that everybody's ready to go for your presentation. So Claire is a research specialist with the Texas Water Resources Institute, specializing in watershed protection planning and working with community stakeholders and groups for the planning of these common resources. She's got some great slides and lots of links. I'm going to be dropping some of the links of the resources that she has as shared material in our chat room today. I'm also going to share those to Facebook at a later time and date once the live presentation ends. So again, welcome everybody, and thank you, Claire, for joining us today.
Thank you, and thank you, Mary Pearl and Michelle, for inviting me, and thank y'all for joining in over your lunch hour. If you don't mind stop sharing, then I think I can, yeah.
Okay, I'm going to hand this over to you, and you should have sharing options now.
Can you see the presentation?
Yes, ma'am. Looks great.
All right, perfect. Well, thank you all again for joining in. As Mary Pearl said, my name is Clare Escamilla. I'm with the Texas Water Resources Institute, and I'm going to be talking to y'all a little bit about some of the work that we do in watershed protection planning and how we use that to help address some of the water quality and quantity issues that we have here in Texas. But obviously, before I get into watershed protection planning, I kind of want to start backwards and just talk about what are the water resources we have here in Texas, and where do we see kind of the future needs and future concerns, because that's going to help set the groundwork for what we do with watershed protection planning. So a look at all of the freshwater resources we have here available in Texas. We've got about 191,000 miles of rivers and streams, and about 20% of that is perennial flow. And for those of you not familiar with the term, perennial flow means the majority of the time, about 90% or more, if you go out to that river or stream, you're going to see water in it. So it's able to sustain a base flow, and even during those drier months, like in the summer when we're not getting a lot of rain, there is usually still water in it. So since there is always the presence of water, it's got those defined banks and channels. It's able to support aquatic species and macroinvertebrates, as well as support some of that wetter vegetation. So about 20% of our rivers and streams in Texas fall under that perennial flow. We've also got over 200 major reservoirs throughout Texas. We've got 5 million acres of freshwater wetlands, 9 major aquifers and 21 minor aquifers, as well as a little under 13,000 named springs. So as you all can imagine, Texas is a big state, so we've got a lot of freshwater resources. And you can kind of see that that's broken up between surface water and groundwater. So for surface water, that's our streams, our rivers, and our lakes. You can see here, we've got 23 major river basins. So those are the basins for all of our major rivers here in Texas. The majority of them, they start further out west and they'll drain eastward, most of them entering out into the Gulf. These are surface water, our streams, rivers, and lakes. They're publicly owned. So that means in order to divert them or take water out of the creek to use it, does require a permit from a state agency. So they most of our streams most are fully allocated, and so they already have a lot of the water rights already out. But in order to do anything with that surface water, you do need to have a permit from the state agency. Our other source of water is groundwater. So that's the water that's stored underground in aquifers. And you can see again here out over to the right, these are the major and minor aquifers we have here in Texas. And you can see really they span across most of Texas. And of course, they don't stop right at our state boundaries. A lot of them we also do share with our bordering states. And differently than surface water, our groundwater is considered a private property right here in Texas. So if you are a landowner and you own land over an aquifer, then you're able to build a well and be able to pump out water for your own personal use. We do have started the creation of some groundwater conservation districts that do provide a little bit of oversight. They might have some pumping limits or other things just to protect the integrity of that groundwater and make sure that it's something that, you know, everyone in that area can utilize. But for the most part, if you aren't in one of those areas or you have land over a aquifer, then you're able to take it out and use what you want with it. But of course, with that private property right, you're also responsible for all of the expenses that go with constructing the well, with pumping, and with all the maintenance and the water quality testing that goes along with it. So that's all of the responsibility of the landowner. And so that kind of is an interesting thing because the interaction between surface and groundwater varies based on the soils, the geology, topography of the area we're talking about in Texas, but there is an interaction between our surface and groundwater. So that provides some interesting, especially when we see times of drought where our water resources might be more strained than usual, and maybe some of those surface waters, they're starting to limit some of those junior water rights to preserve that surface water. So more people are moving to discharge groundwater, but of course those two are connected. So that can cause a strain, especially when we are in periods of drought. But the other thing to note when you do see this interaction between surface and groundwater is that if you are a landowner that has a well on their property and also may be have a stream going through your property, you need to monitor those, because if you're noticing maybe further upstream there's been a spill or something has changed and you're noticing a change in color or odor in the surface water, then you might need to check your groundwater and your well's water quality sooner than you might normally because of that interaction. So it's something to be aware of, and something that the state is looking at more on how to understand this interaction so that we can better manage it in the future. And so just as surface water and groundwater, they're interconnected, the land surrounding our water resources is also connected. So the overall health of our water bodies and the integrity of our water resources is directly impacted by what's going on in and around that water body. So that's why we really try to talk to folks and get the word out about how protecting those water resources, you do need to look at it on a watershed scale. And so just very generally what a watershed is that area of land that drains either above ground or underground into a shared body of water. So you can see in this photo here, when rain comes, if it falls on this side of the divide, it's going to fall into this watershed. If it goes on the other side, then that's going to be in a different watershed. And so as it's running off, obviously, you know, if you have these different interests, you might have your industrial, urban areas, rural areas. So anything that's happening on the land as that water is running off, it can pick up those things. So that's why it's important to think about this watershed scale. And it's a nested system. So, you know, if we go back a few slides, when we look at our major river basins, those are watersheds, and you can see how large they are. That's a lot of area of land when you're thinking about protecting that water resource integrity and what's going on the land. Those are big areas to talk about, but you can also look at it on smaller scales. with just a smaller tributary, just a small section of that, and look on that smaller watershed. But you do really need to look at what's going on in the land to understand better what's happening in and around the creek. And of course, as you can kind of see with those major river basins, our water bodies don't follow our typical city-county lines, our typical political subdivisions. So it's something that requires a concerted effort by a lot of landowners and a lot of different agencies and entities. And you can kind of see that here. So on the left, we have some of the major river authorities here in Texas, and then on the right is those groundwater conservation districts. And you can see these river authorities, as well as the groundwater conservation districts, they have jurisdiction over several different counties and cities, and that's to account for the fact that these watersheds don't follow those traditional boundaries. So we really need to make sure that we're all on the same page with the same goal to protect these resources. And so one way we do that is by statewide water planning. And I think Mary Pearl will drop a link to get the full statewide water plan that you can look at and read on your own time. I'm going to provide a little bit of background on our most recent plan, which is the 2017 State Water Plan, and what's included in it. But if you want to learn more about some of their water management strategies and their findings for water demand, then definitely follow that link and you can get the full document. So the state water plan, they meet every 5 years. So 2017 is the most recently available one we have. The 2022 will be coming out, within the next year. And so every 5 years, when this group, which is a diverse group of different stakeholders with different interests, get together and they look out for the next 50 years and seeing, kind of projecting population, industrial needs, rural agriculture needs, and they see what water is available. And what they do is they always look at the water availability from our drought of record, which is when, our water supplies are the least, but the demand is the greatest. And so for that, that's out in the 1950s is the drought of record that they still use. So based on how much water was available at that drought of record, that's what they're looking to see where there might be potential shortages as we move forward. And there's a lot of public participation in these statewide water plans. And so one major thing that they look at is looking at this population growth and demand. Texas is one of the fastest growing states in the US. They're projecting that by 2070, we're gonna increase our population by over 70%. And of course, with that population increase, that's not happening uniformly across Texas. We'd love it to, but it's not. They're moving to those already densely populated areas. 50% of that increase is projected to happen kind of in the Dallas-Fort Worth region and down in the Houston Metroplex region. So already dense urban centers, so that puts more pressure on them. And over 30 counties, they're projecting that they're going to double their population within the next 50 years. So it's a big concern, and making sure that, we are able to support that growing population and kind of the commercial, industrial, residential needs that go along with that. So how Texas does statewide water planning is they kind of do it from a bottom up. So they understand Texas is a very diverse state. We've got, just climate wise, we have a very wet east and we get very dry as we move further west. And so and some areas are more urban, some areas are more rural. So in order to account for that, they break the state up into 16 different regions. And you can see that on this map here, the 16 different regions in Texas. And then each region elects 23 people, around 23 people, to be the representatives, and they have to have at least representatives from these 12 interests, from agriculture, environment, groundwater, someone just from the general public, your county officials, municipalities, industry, river authorities, electric, water districts, water utilities, and small businesses. So they need to have at least those 12, and then they can have a couple extra to make sure that we're representing everybody's interest. Everyone's at the table talking about what water they see that they're going to be needing in the future and how we're going to address these issues. So they identify potential water shortages that they may see. if another drought of record comes about. And then they also, part of it is they need to come up with recommended water management strategies. So, okay, if you are projecting out shortages, what do you see as a solution, and an estimated cost on what it would cost to actually implement all of those strategies to be able to have enough water if another drought of record comes about. And so just kind of on a general, the supply and demand. So from the 2017 State Water Plan, this is kind of a look at where they see projections going on what the water demand is for the next 50 years. So you can see for irrigation, they're actually projecting that there's going to be a decline in water need. And that's because there's a lot of new research and a lot of new technology that's coming out to make irrigating for agriculture a lot more sustainable, a lot less waste. So they're going to need less water to be able to still produce what they need to produce. And some areas like with livestock, mining, steam and electric, they're already, fairly kind of as efficient as they can be. So there's not a lot of change, but of course, as the population increases, there might be some slight increase in it, but they kind of stay generally pretty stable through the next 50 years. The one that we see the biggest increase on is, of course, the municipal, which goes with that increased population. So that's kind of the, a big driver on making sure that we can, what we can do to sustain that increase in population and that growing water demand. And so looking at all the different recommended strategies from the state water plan, they estimate that, about 30% of that, we're going to need to do demand management. And what that means is kind of reducing the need for water. So either making things more efficient, so having more water efficient things in people's households, the irrigation, making it more efficient. So, not using the water we have, but in a better way, so there's less waste. And as well as for drought management, so how can we use less water in times of drought? So about 30% of our future water needs, they see kind of just being able to manage the demand of water better. But then the majority of it is actually coming up with new water supplies. So looking at water reuse, so from wastewater treatment plants, like how can we be able to reuse some of that water and repurpose it? You see that in some areas, they use that to irrigate different parks. They might reuse water. Some of that comes from groundwater, being able to extract more. There's also look at doing desalination with some of that brackish groundwater, which opens up more available groundwater for us. Again, with seawater, some desalination with that. And surface water, a lot of that is building new reservoirs around the state, as well as maybe buying some of the existing water rights on lakes so that they have more of the water rights for our rivers and streams. And so kind of this breaks it down a little bit more on the different strategies. So I encourage y'all, if you're interested in learning more about some of these strategies and their costs, where they're looking at it, which region, I encourage you to go to that link and kind of read more about it. But I will say, so, looking at all of these potential strategies, the estimated cost that was given from the different regions would be $63 billion, which is obviously no small amount of money. But that, includes everything from permitting, design, acquiring those water rights, and the land that they might need, and construction. But it is important to note, and they note this in the statewide water plan, that if we do face those water shortages, if we're not able to have enough water to meet the demand, then that, causes a lot of economic loss for the workers and the businesses here in Texas. And by 2070, if with those potential water shortages, that could be up to 151 billion, which is a lot more than the 63. So even though it is a big price tag, being able to implement some of these strategies now kind of allows us to be more proactive, kind of push back that where there might be potential shortages, and a smaller price tag in the long run than if we're being reactive and trying to figure out how to fix these things after they already happen. So that's kind of my quick overview of the state water plan. I'll take a quick pause if there's any questions on water planning before I move on to some water quality.
Yeah, Claire, there's some great questions coming in. I don't think we're going to be able to answer all of them in this quick break, but one question that I thought you might address with the Master Naturalist here, you talk about all of these different strategies and groups. One question is there a water for nature or for natural processes allocation considered, and is that what the environment category addresses in planning?
Yeah, so that environmental is trying to look at what the environmental flows that are needed to support the vegetation and the aquatic species and wildlife. So that is something, unfortunately, so that back when, a lot of these rivers and streams were first allocated, that wasn't always considered. So that's something that as it's becoming more important and more noted as a concern, some of those buying water rights back are to help support those environmental flows.
Excellent, thank you. There's more questions, but I'm going to hold on to them until we get further along. I think you're going to answer some of these questions.
Okay, perfect. So now I want to talk to you all about water quality. So, obviously we know that water is a very precious resource. As we see from the statewide water plan, we know that we're going to need more water in the future. There's going to be greater demands. And demand management is part of it. So making sure we're protecting and efficiently and effectively using our water resources that we already have. So important part of that is protecting the water quality. And so I want to talk to y'all about water quality in Texas and what we do. So we're not the only group that does water quality monitoring. We do some of it. There's a lot of different agencies and groups around Texas that monitor these streams and make sure that they're meeting their designated uses and their water quality standards so that we can continue to recreate in them, use them for drinking water supplies, be able to support aquatic species. So I'm going to explain a little bit about how those water quality standards are set, as well as how we analyze and see if they're meeting their standards. So the Clean Water Act, which is set by the Environmental Protection Agency, requires that every state adopts specific water quality standards. And that is put on to the state. So the Texas Commission of Environmental Quality then kind of sets the standards for Texas, which have to be approved by the EPA. And so based on a specific designated use, and I'll talk about designated uses in the next slide, they have, their specific water quality standards that they have to meet. And then we do the water quality monitoring to see if they're meeting those water quality standards for their designated use. And then every 2 years, the state looks at all of the available data and kind of sees where the water quality in our rivers and streams are. And if they are considered impaired, so they're not meeting their water quality standards, they get put on this integrated report. And then it goes into, okay, well, what's the strategy now to try to get it to be delisted, to improve its water quality so that it's back meeting all of its standards. So here's an example of some of those surface water quality standards. So for primary contact recreation, the big thing is looking at bacteria, because if people are swimming or wading, especially children, making sure that if they accidentally ingest some of that water, that their risk is low enough that they're not going to get sick. So they look at bacteria. For aquatic life, they look at dissolved oxygen and some nutrients in it, and they come up with pH, temperature. So what's going to help support the aquatic life there, and they'll come up with water quality standards for that. Secondary contact recreation is a newer standard that they have, and it's something for streams and creeks where people might not be actively recreating, but maybe fishing, kayaking. So the risk of ingestion is less, so that their bacteria standards a little higher. Some of the other designated uses are for drinking water, for actual fish consumption. So for people who are fishing in those, making sure they're safe to consume. And so they all have their own specific host of water quality standards that they need to meet. And so what they do is they look at the available data that's out there. And so this is a look at all of the stream flow gauges and water quality stations around Texas, as well as I sent over the link to kind of be put into the chat that includes the Texas Commission of Environmental Quality's, their water quality viewer. So you can actually go to your area, click on one of those stations and you can download and see what the water quality looks like. It's a big Excel document, so you kind of have to do a little bit of cleanup. If that's something you're interested in, you can definitely email me and I can help you kind of learn how to read through that. But it does list, you know, all the different monitoring. It can go back into from the 90s, so it's a lot of data. But what they do is every 2 years, they kind of go and look at the streams and rivers that are being monitored, and they look at the last 7 to 10 years of data. So they try to grab a lot of data that covers, you know, our wetter times, our drier times, so different months, different years. So, you know, it covers those drought months, it covers when there might have been a lot of rain and there might have been floods. So you get a really good representative water quality from all that time. So after looking at that 7 to 10 years of data, then they decide if it's meeting its water quality standard based on its designated use or not, and then it gets put onto that list. So if it does seem like it's impaired, there's a lot of steps on how they're going to go about to improve water quality. So the first thing is figuring out if it's used for swimming. So if there is primary contact recreation, since bacteria is the main impairment that we see, and that's for that designated use of contact recreation. So if it isn't, then they try to see if they can maybe do a standards change so that then there's a higher water quality standard. But I'm going to focus on, you know, if it is used for swimming, because that's where we kind of get more to the watershed protection planning. So if there is contact recreation, we figure out if there's enough data. Is it really just within the last 7 to 10 years? Maybe it's only been monitored 10 times, like once a year. So there needs to be more data to be more representative of what the actual water quality is. So if there isn't enough data, then we do projects where we conduct more monitoring so that we can really understand what the water quality looks like throughout the year through several different years. If there is enough data and it's still showing that impairment, that's when we move to developing either a total maximum daily load or a watershed protection plan. And our preference, we like to do the watershed protection plans, and I'll talk about those more in a few slides, but they are more holistic. They let us address a lot of different water quality concerns. They're stakeholder driven, they're voluntary, all the measures. So usually the community can get behind them a little bit more because they're not worried that we're going to force them to do anything. We really are looking for support from them. So we then move to do the watershed protection plan. And so, as I mentioned, you know, bacteria is one of the main, is the main water quality impairment that we're seeing in Texas. And so here on the right, this is just a look. The red is all of the bacteria impairments that we see throughout Texas. So it's widespread. And if you're wondering where that bacteria comes from, we like to say anything with hair, fur, feathers can be a contributor to bacteria in the watershed. So we are, wildlife is, our pets, livestock. So that's why we have to be careful and make sure that what we're doing on the land is reducing the risk of some of those potential things from getting into our streams and creeks. So the main sources of some of those pollutions are point source and non-point source. So point source, kind of as the name alludes to, a lot of times it's coming directly out from a pipe. So you can kind of point to where that is getting discharged into the creek. So that's a lot of your wastewater treatment plants, some of your industrial facilities or confined animal feeding operations where they have a pipe that's directly emptying out into the creek. And so for any of that point source pollutant, it does require a permit from the state. So there are monitoring requirements, as well as every several years, the state will come in and audit to make sure that you are meeting your water quality standards and your discharge limits. So there is some regulation that goes along with those point sources. The other one is non-point source. So with point source, you can literally point and say, this is where it's entering in. Non-point, you can't do that. It's more disperse and diffuse off of the landscape. So really just anything that can get caught up during those larger runoff events, either during a storm. So some of your, your urban gasoline or litter or pet waste or anything that may be on the ground that can get caught up during those runoff events. The same for wildlife and feral hogs, livestock, especially if they're spending a lot of time in and around the creek. You might be defecating in and around it, so they can be a direct contributor to bacteria. Crops can, especially if you're overusing fertilizers or pesticides, using them at the wrong time or just not in the right amount or not disposing of them properly, then that can be a contributor, as well as on-site septic systems. So if you're not properly maintaining them, getting them drained when they need to, and just keeping up with the general maintenance, then it has the possibility to be discharging, raw sewage in and around the watershed. So since there's not one specific point of entry, it's harder to monitor it or to set a permit saying you can only have this much in it. So that's where kind of we get into that watershed theme where, well, let's try to make sure that we are maintaining our septic systems, that we're using nutrient management correctly, that we are being good stewards of the land in our urban areas to reduce some of the risk of that runoff actually picking up some of those potential pollutants and then entering into our rivers and streams. So I'll stop quickly again if there's any water quality related questions. If not, then I'll move on to watershed protection planning.
Claire, I think you can move on. There's some fantastic questions coming in, but you're answering some of the previous questions, and then there's a lot of questions about water runoff and kind of the larger scale planning efforts.
Okay, yeah, so I'll definitely touch on some planning, but yeah, if it doesn't seem like I answer anything, definitely I'll get it at the end, address it at the end.
Excellent, thank you.
So watershed protection planning, it's not something that we just at the Texas Water Resource Institute does. It's something that's done from river authorities in your cities. It happens around the state. But it's really looking, again, trying to address especially some of those non-point source that are coming off of the landscape and seeing what we can do in the community, what we can implement to try to reduce some of those pollutants from possibly washing off and entering into our rivers and streams. And this is another point where there's a link, so you can go onto the website, and if you are living in one of those areas on the map where there's a watershed protection plan, you can click on it. You can see who is the lead on that, the watershed coordinator, and reach out to them. I really do encourage, because as I'll talk about in the next slide, these are stakeholder driven. So the more participation we have, the more successful these plans are. And we have seen success where these watershed protection plans, where we have a lot of good support for implementation, they can lead to delistings where the water quality has improved. So it doesn't happen without the local community having that buy-in. So definitely, if you live in one of those areas, I encourage you to reach out and see if you can participate in the planning or the implementation of one of these plans. So as I kind of briefly started talking about, so it's really a holistic plan to address water quality issues. So even if bacteria is the only impairment, if you see a lot of nutrient issues, sometimes, there's a lot of concerns with sedimentation. They see a lot of erosion or flooding. Stakeholders are concerned about that. We're able to kind of address on a wider scale as all of these water quality concerns. So that's why we really like them, because we're making sure that we're addressing kind of the big concerns for not only for delisting it, but also for what the community cares about. And everything that's in there is voluntary, which is why we, just like the state water planning, we like to get a wide range of stakeholders, making sure that we're representing our cities, our rural areas, our industry, so that everyone's on the same page. They have that buy-in, they want to improve water quality, and we're making sure that whatever we put in that plan is something that the community actually wants to adopt and hopefully implement further down the road. And the great thing about these protection plans is if you can get one accepted in your area, it opens up additional funding resources so that the watershed coordinator or the local community, you can apply for different grants to help offset some of the costs. So we've had success, applying for grants to help improve, repair, or replace septic systems, add in more pet waste stations, increase the amount of conservation plans for ag land. So it does help, take some of the burden, financial burden off of the community by having one of these plans. Not only do you have a roadmap, but you also then have the opportunity for additional funding to help implement these strategies. And so what goes into a watershed protection plan? So first, we look at identifying the causes and the sources of pollution. So looking to see, is this a mixed watershed where we've got urban and rural? Is it mostly rural, mostly urban? To kind of understand, we look at the wastewater treatment facilities and see if they are in compliance. We look at the number of septic systems in the watershed. We look at the number of dogs in the watershed, because pets, especially if you're not picking up after them, are a big contributor to bacteria in the watershed. We look at all of those things, and we talk with stakeholders on what they see might be the big water quality concerns. And then we do a little bit of water quality modeling. So seeing based on what those potential sources of pollution are and what our current water quality levels are, what we need to do to be able to reduce it, how many different measures do we have to implement. So then we talk about those different management measures and what we need to implement over the next 10 years to see those water quality goals reached. And then we come up with a schedule. We have our measurable milestones so we can see if what we're doing is not working, then we kind of change it. We have our estimated costs and who might be able to help with some technical as well as financial assistance. And then always we try to include water quality monitoring to make sure that we are reaching those goals that we want to reach. And then education and outreach is a big component as well, making sure that we are educating the community on what they can do on their land, the importance of being a good steward in your watershed to help improve water quality. And so that's kind of been our model for a while, going in, having these meetings, developing the plan, and then moving to implementation. But what we've noticed is that occasionally we go to these areas, and for a variety of reasons, whether it's the time of day that we're holding the meeting, sometimes it's a really large watershed, so it's hard for people to travel to the meetings. Sometimes it's just hard to get the word out that we are having these planning meetings, but sometimes we just don't get the kind of response that we want to. We have very low turnout. So, they are grant funded, so we still need to kind of go through the process, but it's hard when we don't get that buy-in and that community interaction and support. So we've been, as an institute, looking at other ways that we can interact and communicate with the community to be able to improve water quality and kind of improve some land practices. So this is a recent project that one of my coworkers has worked on, doing targeted mailers. So just a little bit of background, this is for the Lavaca River watershed. So we have an accepted plan there. It's got, the bacteria issues. It's mostly rural. And throughout the planning process, we didn't have a lot of stakeholder support. The stakeholder meetings were smaller than we'd like to see. So we were trying to figure out a way, now that we're in implementation, how we can encourage them to, adopt some of these, work with the Natural Resource Conservation Service, the Texas State Soil and Water Conservation Board to adopt some of these implementation strategies on their working lands. So first they thought about virtual, but especially for rural landowners, sometimes, email is not the best way to reach them, but also we started this over COVID. So definitely interacting virtually was kind of an overload. We had to look at just the overall cost and how we could reach as many people as possible. And so we came up with doing these mailers. So just trying to increase the adoption of some of the best management practices specifically for landowners. So what my coworker did was he reached out to the local county appraisal district and found landowners that had beef cattle operations on their property. And he was looking at two counties, Lavaca and Goliad County. And so first he sent out a few times a pre-evaluation to just understand kind of the demographics of both of the counties and the areas. And then after he got that, then he sent out these educational mailers, which he did every 2 months. And then he updated his list if he got non-deliverables. But basically really trying to explain kind of what overstocking was, how you can understand that, and what you can do to improve some conservation practices on your land. And so this is just to look at the pre-evaluation results. So I kind of highlighted a few of the big things here that I want to take away. So he sent these both out to Goliad and Lavaca County, because ideally he wanted to send the mailers out to Lavaca County and kind of use Goliad as a control. And so you can see here, 80% male, their age range was very similar to most of their demographics match pretty closely. So it showed it was kind of these two counties were good to kind of stand as seeing if there was any change when we kind of send out these mailers, target them specifically, as opposed to not doing anything, because the watersheds and the landowners that were there kind of had the same background as well as a demographic. And so this is a look at the educational mailer. So again, kind of talking about figuring out your stocking rate and if you're overstocking and what can that lead to. So he sent that out several times, 4 times over every couple months to those same landowners. If he got undeliverables, it was updated. And then he worked with the local NRCS to see if there was any change in land practices. So before any of the mailings started, so 2016, 17, 18, 19, you can kind of see how many NRCS plans were adopted, the natural resource conservation. And you can see in general, they stay pretty close together. So 2020 is when the first mailers were sent out. And so blue is Lavaca County. So you can see there was an increase there, but also there was a slight increase in Goliad County as well. But then you can notice 2021, it's kind of dropped back down. And again, it's really high. So we are, optimistically thinking that this was one successful way of being able to reach landowners who might not traditionally come to our meetings. We're trying to be adaptive and think of other ways that we can reach out and connect and get the word out about what we can do to improve our watersheds and our water quality. So this is something we're looking at trying out in other watersheds, as well as instead of just looking at livestock, but also looking at septic systems, how we can expand this out. But preliminarily, we're feeling pretty good that, it is helping to get the word out and increase participation. So I'm going to talk about also what y'all can do and how we hope to work with y'all in the future to help conserve water and improve water quality in your area. I'll see if there's any water quality, watershed protection planning questions.
There was one great question that asked, and I'm trying to lump some of these questions together, asking about the authorities. Oh gosh, I've just now lost this one. Asking about the different authorities and the differences between river authorities and groundwater conservation districts. Do they overlap geographically? And if so, who has more power?
So river authorities and groundwater conservation districts, they can overlap. I guess, not specifically a groundwater conservation district, but where I am in San Antonio, we've got the San Antonio River Authority and we've got the Edwards Aquifer Alliance, and there's overlap there. So that is possible. I would believe, since right now, as it still stands, the surface water, that is public and requires permits. So they kind of do have, and as the groundwater is still private, the river authorities kind of do have the preference there. But that is something that the groups are trying to work at and, be able to improve because of that connection, and making sure that one is not hurting the other if a lot of people are pumping or accidentally discharging things into the creek that might affect groundwater.
That actually leads into another great question, and then I'll let you continue with your presentation. Could you answer if or how individuals could get copies of their local watershed protection plans if they exist within their local watersheds?
Yeah, so if you go back to that website, I think you put in the chat that it has the watershed protection plans from the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality. It lists all of them. If you go and click on them, it should show you the entity. And they also have an Excel spreadsheet on their website that will link you to the actual watershed protection plan, as well as the main entity. So if it's a city, it'll take you to their city website and that watershed protection plan page. So you can use that viewer. If you're having trouble clicking on sometimes, even our website changes and sometimes links die. So if you know that you're in the San Antonio area, you could look up Upper San Antonio River Watershed Protection Plan or Lavaca River Watershed Protection Plan, and a Google search might get you there, but they do try to keep those links updated. But I know even I sometimes go in and the link is dead. But definitely a Google search will get you. If not, you can also email me and I can help point you in that direction, even if it's not one that we specifically work with. But I've gotten really good at searching for them. So
excellent. And I dropped that link in the chat for folks, and I'll put it on Facebook as well. Thank you, Claire.
Thank you. So there's several different things, whether you live in a more rural area or more urban, that you can do to help conserve water as well as protect water quality. One great one is rainwater harvesting. So, being able to capture some of that rainwater and then use it later in place of using, water from your house. So I know a great way, especially in the San Antonio area, there's always a big push for doing rainwater harvesting, collecting it, and then they use it to water their lawns or their gardens instead of using a traditional hose. So that's great to be able to reuse that water. Besides being able to conserve water and reuse it, you're actually capturing a lot of potential water that could then run off and into your storm drains. So it does help reduce runoff and possible erosion, and reduce the risk of that picking up any potential contaminants on your roads or parking lots or streets. So there's a lot of great water quality and quantity benefits to doing rainwater harvesting, and a lot of different ways you can use it. It's not treated, so don't use it for drinking water, but you can definitely use it for several other benefits. Practicing nutrient management, I mentioned this a little bit with the non-point source pollution, but just making sure that if you do use fertilizers, that you are using the right amount at the right time. We always recommend testing your soils first, figuring out what nutrients are already in the ground before you go ahead and just buy just a generic fertilizer. And those soil tests, A&M does do soil testing, and based on what you want to grow, they can give you estimates of what you actually need. And then to make sure you're applying those during those active growing seasons, so that they are actually getting those nutrients. It's not a time when they're dormant, and so you're just applying it, but your plants are not getting any of that benefit. And if you are a landowner that has a creek or a stream going through your property, to make sure that you don't mow or farm all the way up to the banks, to make sure that you're leaving some kind of filter and buffer strip. That vegetation not only helps trap some potential contaminants, those roots help strengthen it, so you're reducing erosion and reducing some excessive sediment from getting into the creek. So definitely make sure you're protecting those banks. Otherwise, there's risk that you're going to be losing land, which you don't want anyways. And then if you are doing landscaping in your home, try to, as much as you can, select native or drought tolerant plants. So native plants, for the most part, are well adapted to the climate here in Texas anyway, so that you don't need to do as much supplemental watering or irrigation. There's lots of great studies through AgriLife and other groups on drought tolerant plants too. So again, that they don't need a lot of water, but provide that good, the nice look that you want for your garden. And it's, less maintenance, so it's less expensive. You're using less water, which also saves you money. Taking control of your irrigation system. So whether you're working agriculture with irrigation or just watering your lawn, irrigation is a big water user. And it's the biggest one for homeowners is your outside watering. So, where you can use rainwater harvesting is great. If you do still want to use sprinkler systems, make sure, one, if it's during a time of drought, you're following your city's regulations about certain times or days that you're watering. But also just every once in a while, I know, especially here in San Antonio, when we hit drought restrictions, you're supposed to be watering, pretty early in the morning or late at night. So it might not be times when you're actively outside. And there's times when I walk my dog in the morning and I'll see that a sprinkler head has fallen off and it's just making a big geyser, or it's been turned around, so it's actually shooting all of the water onto the street and not even onto your lawn. So then you're not getting that benefit, and you're increasing runoff in the area. So to just make sure every once in a while you check up on your irrigation systems to make sure that they're all working properly and dispersing where you want them to, so you're getting that benefit and not wasting any water. And there's a lot of great tools too if you're do any agricultural practices, that any farming, that you can see what the soil moisture is in the ground, so you know how much you need to water and when you need to water. So there's a lot of great tools out there to make sure that you are irrigating effectively and efficiently. Another big one is making sure that we're fixing leaks. And I know that was a big hot topic after some of those winter storms. We had a lot of leaks when our pipes froze over. So just to always be on the lookout if you see water pooling anywhere. Sometimes you can kind of hear it, like if you don't have any water running and you open up the doors underneath your sink or something, you might be able to hear some water. But those are good ways to kind of look out to see if there's any leaks. Watching your water bill as well. If you know you're not using a ton of water, you're not watering your lawn that much, but your bill's still pretty high, there might be a leak somewhere. But we can lose close to 10,000 gallons of water a year, just a single household, due to leaks. And where you can, install water conserving appliances. So outside of your lawn watering, toilets and washing machines are the other big water users. So there's been a lot of great advances in some of those on using low flow, or based on what you do, you can do a low flow or a higher flow for your toilets. And then for your washing machines, there's a lot of high efficiency ones now, and I think they're becoming a little bit more cost effective as they become more and more popular. But using those water conservation tools really do help save water, and it also saves you money. Other great ones too, I've said it a few times, but making sure you pick up after your pet. I know I've always come across people who say, well, wildlife, they go to the bathroom out there, so I don't need to worry about my dog. But just because, especially in our cities, we have such a high density of people, and a lot of people have pets. So that's just an overload in the system that's going to contribute negatively and increase bacteria. And I feel like these pet waste stations, there's so many now, it's a lot easier to not even have to hold the bag for the whole time you're walking. You can usually find a trash can pretty easily. So picking up after pets, encouraging other people to, if you want to wash your car, do it on a grassy area instead of in your driveway. That driveway is impervious, so all of that water and that soap is going to kind of wash off and go down into your storm drains, which then can pick up other things. If you do it on your lawn, not only are you watering your lawn, but you're also washing your car, so you get multiple benefits for that. And to never dump anything down the drain, down those storm drains. They do drain directly to a water body. They don't get treated. And so even if you're not actively just going over and dumping it, make sure if you have lawn clippings or you've done yard work, don't just leave it in a pile, possibly by the side of the road, where it can get kind of accidentally sawed up and washed down into a storm drain. So just to be mindful of that, to clean up any of those yard clippings or lawn clippings and dispose of them so that they don't get down into the storm drain and then out into your river, stream, lake, wherever it drains to. And I want to kind of end talking about some future opportunities we see for collaboration with master naturalists and the Texas Water Resource Institute. So kind of as we saw with our educational mailings, there are more people that we need to reach, and it's hard for us. A lot of times we work in watersheds that we don't live in. We're traveling to them, so we only have so many meetings a year, as well as other projects. So we need to find a better way to connect with the community. And we see working with master gardeners and master naturalists as kind of a natural fit. Y'all are already great stewards of the land, already are probably doing most of the water quality actions that I talked about before. So this is something that we've been developing, and we're going to work on kind of piloting this fall, where we train master naturalists and master gardeners. So much more in detail about the watershed protection planning, about different implementation strategies. You'll kind of go through all of our big training programs, getting the highlights from them. And then what we hope is that you'll be able to take those. We'll give you all the tools you need, but you can go and kind of talk about the watershed protection plan and some of the implementation efforts around your community. So whether that's going to farmers markets or you know, different shows or events that are going on in your community, being able to present in schools or other city or local meetings, talking about the plan and what people can do. We see that as a great benefit to be able to reach more people and encouraging them to be good stewards. So it's something that we have coming down the pipeline. And even if you live in a watershed that we don't specifically work in, we still see a benefit of y'all taking this training and learning about the protection planning process and some of these strategies, because people can implement these whether there's a watershed protection plan in your area or not. So we really want to encourage y'all, and I'll make sure to share that with Michelle and Mary Pearl as we get that piloted so you can sign on and learn more about it and participate. And then another great one is we've got a lot of great educational programs. For those of you that might have taken Texas Riparian and Stream Ecosystems training, I'm an instructor for that as well as I organize that one, but AgriLife has a lot of great other ones. I think Mary Pearl can put down, we post all of our events on our website, so you can kind of follow that, as well as join the listservs, which I think if she doesn't post in this one, it'll be in the next slide, where you can join our listserv and be up to date with all of the different events and where they're happening. But I would definitely encourage y'all to invite your friends to come and come to these trainings, because you'll learn a lot from them and be able to ask a lot of great questions. We also, if you still want to learn more about water, we've got a lot of great publications. And so that link will be dropped into the chat as well, where you can subscribe. We've got our H2Os, where we cover hot topics on water quality and quantity, not just in the state, but also kind of globally. And that comes out about twice a year, as well as we've got a monthly newsletter and kind of a quarterly newsletter. So we've got a lot of great additional outreach that we would love to share. And if you all want to get involved, you can get the hard copy, or you can get it sent to your email and be able to read some of those. And it's just work that's being done, not just at the Institute, but all around to address water quality and quantity. So with that, I'm going to end it. I just want to thank y'all again for joining in. I get to see Western Naturalists all the time at the riparian trainings, and y'all always are the best crowd. You always have the best questions and are very passionate and already doing a lot of great things. So I really appreciate you listening in, and hope that I can work with y'all in the future for volunteering or at trainings.
Thank you so much, Claire. And you mentioned the great questions that Master Naturalists have. They always jump ahead of the game and ask questions that that our presenters are going to answer, and then they always dive really deep into some of the deep details. So I have a huge list of questions here. We are right at the 1 o'clock hour, but if you don't mind, could we hang out for another 9-10 minutes or so?
Yeah, definitely. I can do another 10 minutes.
Okay. All right, I'm going to ask some of these questions, and I do apologize for those that I don't get to. And you've got great kudos coming in the chat, so everybody's really enjoyed the presentation. I've tried to group some of the questions, so I hope that I can kind of provide a collaborative answer for multiple questions in one. So there are 3 questions that really focused on working with HOAs and irrigation and lawn management, all the way from an example of Las Vegas paying folks to remove lawns. How close are we to an extreme system like that? Or how can we work with our HOAs, our local watershed protection plans, in conserving for turf grass irrigation?
Well, that is a great question, and it's actually something that internally we've been talking about, working with HOAs, because I know when I do the riparian trainings, as well as when we do these watershed meetings, you know, we talk about kind of allowing to grow up your lawns a little bit, or how to kind of do less watering. But of course, then sometimes if you live in an HOA, you get a note, you could get fined. So we are trying to think of ways on how we can engage with those HOAs. Right now, our best thing is trying to get them to come to our meetings and our training so that they can actually learn and hope that that will inspire some kind of change. But that's just kind of small, a slow change. I guess, the question for statewide, where there might be restrictions on or incentives to remove lawns, I don't think we're at that point yet. We are in a little bit different situation than Vegas, especially, we do get a fair amount of rain eastward. It's more dry as we move out west. So, maybe further west, they might see something like that. But I think we're still far way off from any big incentive programs to change your lawns practices.
I think there's a role for Master Naturalists in just educating our general public on the values for water conservation, the value of water conservation, of wildscaping lawns, and providing healthy ecosystems for the benefit of everyone.
Yeah, and I will say, like, when homeowners see things happening, then they're more likely to adapt it on their own. And I know even in Austin, we work with some folks at the Parks and Wildlife, and there are homeowners that have adapted some of these types of practices on their lawns, and they put little signs like restoration in progress, or, I'm acting as a sponge, and that starts the conversation. So definitely whatever you can do kind of on your own and talking to people about it, then that helps a ton get that word out and incentivize other people once they can see it and how well it works.
Yeah, we had a great presentation from Dr. Doug Tallamy a few months ago talking about wildscaping and the ripple effect that has for educating your neighbors as well. A few more questions while we still have you for another 5 minutes. There were 3 questions that focused on desalinization. You talked about that early on in this presentation. Can you talk about desalinization as a solution to droughts, or what the current status is of desalinization management in Texas?
Yeah, so we do have some desalination plants. Most of them are doing brackish groundwater. So we're not like in California where we're actually, taking, very, very salty water from an ocean, or from, for us, it would be from the Gulf to do anything like that. So that's something that it doesn't make up a lot of our water. I think it's, I don't remember the exact, but I think it's only like 1 or 2% of our water availability. So it's still a very new practice. It is something that they are looking at ramping up and expanding, and it is becoming a little bit more cost effective as it's getting used more and more. There are still those questions about what to do with kind of that brine, that very salty water after you're done. And I think there's still a lot of work on, the disposal of that, and if there's any environmental impacts. And so I think that type of work will still come along in understanding that. But right now it's a small little chunk, but it's something that's becoming more popular.
Thank you. And then 2 more questions. Hopefully I can get them all in. There were some questions about are there any new major reservoirs in the planning stages, specifically reservoir management or additional reservoirs along riverways to eliminate devastating flooding downstream?
So there definitely are new reservoirs, and so that's where I would encourage you to go to that state water plan and kind of look at those specific regions. Most of the reservoirs that are being proposed are kind of further east and north. So I know there's some in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. In Houston, they can't use a lot of groundwater because of subsidence, so they are looking at adding in more reservoirs. So and I think there, will be some of that for the flood control too, being able to kind of control, hold back some of those floodwaters. I don't know about very specifically, but that's where you can go and look at your specific region, and you can see where those are being proposed.
Excellent. And then last question in the last couple of minutes, Claire, again, thank you so much for staying with us. And I'm trying to drop as many links in the chat as possible. I dropped that statewide water planning document in the chat again. Can you talk a little bit more? You mentioned some of the environmental quality aspects of runoff for riparian and stream management. Can you talk about some of the the species management or the ecosystem within the stream bed itself. So a question came in about zebra mussels and how much that plays into the data of watershed clarity, or about the health of filter feeders, some of the biodiversity that lives and reigns within our watersheds, what their values are, and how your institute or how the watershed protection plans encounter some of this data.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I know I'm not going to be able to answer it probably as well as they want, and that's if that person or group, they email me, I'll get you in contact with our folks at the Parks and Wildlife Department who works with us, because they do a lot more work on the aquatic the aquatic species, the zebra mussels. They do a lot more work on that than we do. We don't really do as much of that wildlife work, so they definitely play a role. And I know, especially with those macroinvertebrates, they are so sensitive. They always say, if it's a healthy ecosystem is where you see a wide variety of macroinvertebrates, and they do play a role. I am just I'm not the right person to answer kind of the more specifics of it, but I'm happy to either send it to you, Mary Pearl, their contact information, and they can talk to you more about that.
That would be great. And that's actually a great way to kind of plug additional resources. I'm going to drop the links for TWRI's website again in the chat. You'll have some fantastic publications and resources. Claire, with just kind of the final minute, if you've got any last requests for help for volunteers or resources that they can find for more reading. Again, thank you so much for being with us, and for everybody that else has been with us as well.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, thank y'all. I mean, just sitting in and listening in is always a big thing. And as much as you can spread the word in your community, but the requests are not going to end today, because I'll be sharing as we get that volunteer program rolled out. Hopefully some of y'all are interested in participating in that and helping us kind of be a watershed steward in your area, as well as we get these trainings. If you're interested in participating in those, please sign up. And it's been a long virtual year and a half, so I know I'm excited, and a lot of us are really excited to be able to interact with people again. So definitely please come out. I'm more than happy to talk to y'all more and meet y'all in person.
Well, thank you so much, Claire. It was good to see you, even though that we only got to see you virtually here. We really appreciate your time today, and folks are very complimentary in the chat for your presentation. So really, thank you so very much. For all of our Master Naturalists still on, this recording is going to end shortly, but it'll be posted on our website later tonight or early tomorrow morning. Again, thank you guys so much for joining us for TMN Tuesday. Have a great day.
And Mary, I can add in the links on the PowerPoint and maybe PDF it if you want to include that with the recording.
We'd love that. Yeah, we'll drop it on our TMN Tuesday website. And I'm going to drop that link in the chat so folks can grab it if they don't know where the TMN Tuesday website is. But yeah, that'd be great. Any resources that you have, we'll post to the TMN Tuesday website where folks registered to attend and where this recording is going to be housed as well.
Yeah, I'll definitely work and get that to you by the end of the week. But yes, then you can flip back and hopefully be able to still click on everything.
Okay, excellent. Thank you so much, Claire. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank y'all. Take care.
All right, have a good week.